I'm the one that's blessed that I get to tell a story. Very happy to be here again this year. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
So, every year, for about the last 20 years, I take a retreat. I go for a week to a cabin in the woods by myself. My idea of heaven. It started out as a writing retreat about 20 years ago, then I learned to meditate, and then it just evolved into spending time with self and God and doing nothing. And about 10 years ago, I arrived at the cabin. It was the first time that I had ever arrived without an agenda. I didn't have a writing project. I didn't have things I wanted to learn in meditation or anything. It was just nothing time. And about 3 days into that retreat, I ran into one of the owners of the land, Leslie, and she said to me, "We built a new trail to the Confluence." Now, the Confluence is the place on this land of Buckhorn Springs where the two creeks, Emigrant Creek and Baldy Creek, come together. And I had been there once, about 10 years before that, on one of my first retreats, when I had just been out walking and one of the caretakers kind of popped out from behind a tree and said, "You have to go to the Confluence, it's a power spot." So whenever anyone pops out from behind a tree and says you have to go to a power spot, I'm all in. But I didn't listen carefully to the directions. So I spent about 2 hours scrambling through brush and climbing over boulders, listening for the sound of the water, until I finally arrived at this amazing power spot where the creeks come together. And I climbed out into a large flat rock right in the middle of the streams. And I sat there and I could feel the warmth of the rock and how that warmth came from the sun. And I felt that warmth traveling up my body, and I leaned back and I was laughing. And then I leaned forward and I was weeping. And then back, laughing and forward, as if dancing between two poles, but they were exactly the same, the laughing and the weeping. Now, Leslie said to me, now 10 years later, "There's a new trail to the Confluence and you can walk there in 10 minutes. Now, I was immediately wary. I mean, didn't the Jews have to wander for 40 years in the desert before entering the Promised Land? Right? A good dose of wandering mixed with some suffering is sort of my prerequisite for an experience with the divine. It's kind of the shared memory of our tribe, right? It's in my DNA. But she said I could get there in 10 minutes on this trail. So I thought, since my last experience had been so deep and profound, I didn't want to be disappointed. I thought I would prepare for this trip beforehand. So I meditated for about 2 hours until I could really feel my breathing and my heartbeat, and I could feel a kind of soft calm through my entire being. And I knew I was ready. So I set out on that trail with that soft calm and with that kavanah, the intention of being present, one foot after another. I was going to be present. I wasn't going to be distracted. With each step, I breathed in that warm summer air and I breathed out my thoughts. And the thoughts, well, they did come. And if you're like me and a little bit creative, well, those thoughts can have whole personalities with complicated scenarios. So first came Queen Debra, who was planning on getting enlightened at the Confluence and then writing a book about it, which would involve appearances on Oprah, which would entail new clothes and probably jewelry. So I parked her with a little crown on her head by a little waterfall. I'll see you later. I had to be present, and I kept walking. And then came little Debbie, who had a bad childhood and who was afraid of all new experiences, especially those that might create contact with authentic self, because that might cause her to be abandoned yet again. She has to be soothed regularly, so I parked her with a little imaginary doll and blankie by a little tree and said, "Soothe you later." I had to be present, not now. And I kept walking step after step until I came to the entrance. It's marked with these poles and a crossbow, and I said a little prayer. Rabboni Shalom, Master of the Universe, allow me to be totally present with you. And then I didn't even have to walk down the rest of the trail. I just felt completely propelled by this sense of the divine. And I stood there on the creek and stared. The two creeks splashed together, cascading into each other, bursting into praise. The air felt so filled with God's presence. It was as if God was in everything and breathing me. In and out, God breathed me. I went to that same rock in the middle of the stream, and I sat down on that rock, and again I could feel the warmth of the rock traveling through my whole body, and I smelled that mineral fish smell of the water, which was the same as the water or the blood, whatever it was that was in my veins. I could see the sunlight flickering through the trees and through the veins of the trees into my veins. It was like I was at the waters of Eden, and God's voice was in everything. Actually, it reminded me of an LSD trip that I took in the 70s. Some of you are nodding. I know you were probably on that same trip. But on that LSD trip, I sat and looked at my kitchen floor as a microcosm of the universe. And marching across that kitchen floor were a parade of ants, and I could hear their chatter, and I understood every word they were saying. Now, I didn't take any more LSD after that because I knew it was too risky. But I had the feeling after that I just want to be able to feel that one more time before I die. And it wasn't the feeling of understanding the language of ants. It was the sensation of everything being completely interconnected. Adonai Echad. God is one. It's all God. Well, there I was, not on any drugs, and I was feeling it. I leaned back on that rock, and I screamed out, "I love God!" Actually, I don't know if I screamed it out or if I just whispered it, because it was all the same. But if you know me, you know that I am not the kind of person who screams out or whispers or says in any way, "I love God," because I'm your average Jew, a God wrestler, right? So I don't know, does God exist? Is there a God? Do I believe in God? What is God? Etc. But not, I love God. But there I was. And I don't know how long I was there because time had no meaning. Eventually I made it back to the cabin and took a hot bath and a long, dreamy nap. And a few hours later, I was out walking, and I ran into the owner, Leslie, again, and I said, "Oh, I took a walk today to the Confluence," and I was just still glowing. And she said, "Yeah, that's great. Nice spot, huh?" But I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "Uh-huh." But I kept thinking in the next few days, nice spot? Could it be that it was just a nice spot in a different frame of mind? But both times I had been there, it had been so absolutely deeply powerful that I didn't want to see it any other way. So I decided not to go back there. But a couple days later, which was the day before I was leaving, I was wandering around again in a meadow, and this time I was kind of distracted. As I said, it was the day before I was going home, so I was mentally answering my future email. And I heard a roaring. Now, I knew instantly nothing on that land roars like that except for the Confluence. But I wasn't on that same trail, but I realized that I was on the opposite side of the trail, going towards the Confluence from the other side. And I knew that if I just walked down a few steps, I could take a peek. It was so tempting, I couldn't resist. So I inched down from the other side of the trail, taking it kind of from the other side of my mind. And I walked down and I kind of saw the creeks coming together. And I thought maybe it was a different place. So I checked for the cairns, the little rock piles that mark it, but they were there. It was the confluence. It was two creeks coming together into a lovely waterfall and birds chirping and pretty trees and water gurgling. It was a nice spot. Now I climbed out onto that rock because I thought, well, maybe if I sat on the rock, right, that some magic would happen, right? But it was a warm rock and I stuck my fingers in the water to get something going, but it was just nice, chilly spring water. I felt like I was in a sci-fi movie where the pulse of the world had been stolen by aliens. I mean, where was God's voice deliriously singing in the stream? Where was God whispering into my veins through the veins of the trees? Where was God anyway? And of course, it did not take me too long to realize that it wasn't that God was missing. God was there. It was that I was not present. When Jacob wakes from his dream in the Bible, the famous dream, he says the famous words, God is in this place and I knew it not. And I always took that to mean that God is everywhere, whether we are aware of it or not. But now I had seen this visceral illustration of it. Now you see it, now you don't. Now you see it, now it's gone. What was the difference? My presence. So the question that I wrestled with for the next day was, how do I bring that into the rest of my life? I'm kind of an all or nothing girl, right? But do I have to stumble for hours through brush and climb over boulders? Or do I have to meditate for a half a day in order to be in contact with God? Because usually in my regular life, I am so tightened into the shape of a productive human that even if God was whispering through the hills directly into my heart, I don't hear it because I'm too preoccupied. So how do we mix that sense of the divine into our daily lives, right? I mean, right now we're at the High Holy Days, so we're in a kind of retreat mode, right? At High Holy Days, we tend to go into a deeper sense of God. We're in the God channel, right? For a while. But how do we mix that in with the rest of our lives? So, on my way home the next day from my retreat 10 years ago, I pulled over on the side of the road and I grabbed a pen and notebook and I wrote down some notes to myself. I'm not going to read you all of them, but I'll read you a few of the crash course in mixing the sacred into the regular. For me, meditate and walk outside every day, even if it's brief. And for an all or nothing girl, even if it's brief is the key word here, right? And you're supposed to be making your own kind of list, right? Remember, it's not always an epiphany. Expect ups and downs. Enjoy the ride, the soft breeze, the body you have. Slow down. Breathe. Keep your feet on the ground. And I'm not going to read you this whole list, but my question to you is, what's on your list? How will we, when we get back to our regular lives, what is it that we can do that might increase our sense of the divine? It's very difficult when you know this, right? We're so distracted by our phones and our internet and whatever else we're doing. It's very, very difficult. But maybe make yourself, we make New Year's resolutions. Maybe make yourself a how do I keep sacred? How do I keep in touch with the divine list this year? Maybe for you it's a daily prayer practice. Maybe it's dancing. Maybe it's singing. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's doing more of whatever connects you to your heart. Doing more of that and less of your phone or whatever. And my final words to myself were, oh, I shouldn't have to read this. God is everywhere. But you just have to show up. And you have to keep showing up. And so may we all this year keep showing up. Shana Tova.